July 1943. A train screeched to a halt in the blistering Texas sun, carrying hundreds of captured German soldiers. They braced themselves for cages, snarling guards, and punishment. But what they found instead was something far stranger. Cowboys. Real men in dusty boots and wide-brimmed hats, watching them with calm eyes and quiet authority. To soldiers who had fought under Hitler's rigid order, this land of cattle, cornbread, and endless horizons felt more dangerous than any prison. It was a glimpse of freedom they had never known. Stay with us, because the disturbing truth of these camps will change how you see captivity itself. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. The train groaned as it slowed across the scorched Texas prairie, sparks spitting from iron wheels grinding against sun-baked rails. Inside, the boxcars reeked of sweat, dust, and fear. The German soldiers crowded against the barred slits of the windows, bracing themselves for what they had been warned about since their capture. They had heard whispers during the long Atlantic crossing, rumors that America would treat them like cattle, starve them, maybe even let them rot in forgotten camps. Some muttered that this was to be their true punishment, not just for losing in North Africa, but for daring to believe in the superiority of the right. They expected guards with snarling dogs, concrete walls rising like fortresses, and bayonets jabbing into ribs to remind them of their fall. Instead, what met their eyes when the train screeched to a stop was almost absurd. No looming gray walls, no barking overseers, just dust swirling in the heat, cattle lowing in the distance, and a man leaning against a fence post as though he had been waiting all along. His boot rested casually on a rail, a wide-brimmed hat shading his eyes, and spurs glinted when he shifted his weight. To the prisoners staring out in disbelief, it was as if the screen of an American film had cracked open and spilled into real life. Someone whispered the word cowboy, half mocking, half awed. They had seen these men in contraband films before the war, gunfighters, ranch hands, outlaws from stories they had dismissed as Hollywood myths. Yet here he was, dust on his boots, chewing a blade of grass, as real as the endless horizon. When the train doors clanged open, the Germans squinted into the blinding light, stumbling onto soil that crumbled under their boots. It was not the cobblestone of Bremen or the rigid order of Berlin. It was loose, endless earth, broken by sagebrush and the faint scent of manure. They braced for humiliation, for jeers from onlookers. Yet the guards who met them were not snarling soldiers, but men who carried themselves with the steady calm of ranchers. Some wore uniforms, others looked like farmhands drafted into duty. Their rifles hung loose, their words few. Children perched on fence rails, staring curiously at the enemy their fathers had fought across oceans. Women in sunbonnets whispered to one another as they watched young German men, no older than their own sons overseas, file into the camp. The prisoners expected harsh voices and rigid discipline. What they received was silence, punctuated only by the groan of wagons, the bark of a distant dog, and the squeak of saddle leather as mounted guards shifted in their saddles. The first shock was not cruelty, but indifference. These cowboys, these farmers turned soldiers, did not seem intent on breaking them down. They seemed only to be watching, calm, unthreatened, as if their authority required no proof. One prisoner later wrote, "I thought I had been captured into a moving picture. Yet it was more real than any film, for I could smell the dust and feel the horizon pressing down on me." As the Germans were marched toward the wire, their unease deepened. The fence was there, yes, but it looked almost fragile compared to the camps they had been warned about. Wooden towers stood unguarded, barbed wire stretched across posts without menace. The prairie itself seemed a prison stronger than steel, stretching so wide it mocked the idea of escape. Some stared out at that horizon and felt something they had not expected: envy. Morning came with a whistle, shrill and sharp, cutting through the low hum of crickets and prairie wind. The prisoners rose stiffly from their bunks, ready for the punishment rations they had been conditioned to expect: watery soup, hard crusts of bread, or worse, starvation. But when they shuffled into the mess hall, fatigue dragging at their boots, their senses betrayed them. The room was heavy with the smell of beef stew simmering in iron pots, coffee boiling so bitter it coated the air, and trays stacked with cornbread, golden and steaming. For men who had crossed deserts in North Africa on empty stomachs, or who had survived on black bread during the long war years in Germany, the sight was staggering. One prisoner later recalled, "The smell itself was torture. My mother had not eaten beef in 3 years, and yet here I was, a captive, served like a guest." They hesitated at first, unsure if it was some cruel trick, a false kindness masking punishment. But the guards, hats tipped back and rifles slung casually, urged them forward with a simple word: eat. No speeches, no taunts, just a command spoken like an invitation. Spoons clattered against tin bowls as the men finally gave in. One soldier closed his eyes as beef melted across his tongue. Another broke cornbread apart with his fingers, surprised by its sweetness. "In Germany," he whispered, "white flour is for the rich. My family has only rye." He chewed slowly, almost guiltily, while others sat in silence, tasting food that felt like betrayal. Their own people were hungry, standing in ration lines back home while they, the defeated, sat in America eating better than they had as free men. Letters sent home, though censored, hinted at the abundance. "Mother, do not worry for me," one wrote in 1944. "I eat here more meat than I did as a boy." Another described the endless coffee, a drink that had been almost mythic in wartime Germany. "We drink it until we are sick of it," he admitted. Guards laughed when they overheard, muttering that the menu was nothing special, just an ordinary farmhand's breakfast. The contradiction was sharp. Captivity meant humiliation, and yet here was abundance. The barbed wire remained outside, but inside the camp, smells of hay and soap mingled with the aroma of bread baking in iron pans. It wasn't luxury, not for Americans, but to men hardened by scarcity, it was excess. For the first time, some prisoners wondered if cruelty would have been easier. At least then, hatred could survive unchallenged. Instead, every spoonful of stew, every slice of cornbread, dug into them with questions far more dangerous. Was this generosity genuine? Or was it a weapon more subtle than bullets, breaking them down not through punishment, but through kindness? When the gates opened for labor detail, the Germans braced for punishment drills, the kind of meaningless torment they expected from victors eager to humiliate them. Instead, they were handed shovels, hoes, and hay hooks. Guards pointed toward wagons and fields rather than barracks yards. It turned out that under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be assigned non-military labor. In the heartland of America, what was needed most wasn't soldiers. It was farmhands. With American men overseas, ranches and fields were starved for labor. Now, the same men who had once carried Mausers through North Africa were carrying grain sacks and water buckets on the Texas plains. At first, bitterness ran deep. Some German officers sneered at the assignments, telling their men that work on American soil was degrading. A few muttered defiantly that they would refuse, that only beatings could force them to bend. But the guards didn't meet defiance with cruelty. They met it with silence. They simply gestured toward the plows, the wagons, the fields. "You work or you don't eat," one said plainly. There was no barking, no theatrics, just a matter-of-fact command. And so, slowly, resentfully, the Germans bent to labor. The rhythm of farm work was unlike anything they had known in Europe. They picked cotton under a punishing sun, bent their backs to mend fences, guided plows behind horses, and hauled water to cattle. Some cursed under their breath. Others, to their own surprise, found themselves watching the Americans at their side. One prisoner described in a diary how a cowboy guard showed him the proper way to lift a hay bale without wrenching his back. The cowboy demonstrated, then stepped aside with a nod. "He did not order me. He taught me," the prisoner wrote. "I was ashamed to realize I had never seen such a thing from a German officer." It was a lesson repeated day after day. Guards worked alongside them at times, sweating under the same sun, speaking in plain words instead of shouts. The prisoners had been taught to equate authority with fear, but these men carried authority with ease, earned not by cruelty, but by competence. The contrast was unsettling. One captured lieutenant admitted to a bunkmate that he had never seen men with power so unbothered by showing it. "They are free men," he whispered, "not chained by their own pride." The days fell into rhythm. Work, sweat, silence, and strange moments of exchange. Some guards offered water when the sun grew merciless. Others corrected German efforts without mockery, only with the quiet efficiency of men who had been doing the same labor since childhood. For soldiers who had once imagined America as decadent, weak, and unworthy, the lesson bit deeper than barbed wire. Here they were, captives in a foreign land, and yet they were learning how to labor with dignity from men who had never marched in parades or worn medals. To the Germans, it was humiliating, and quietly, it was liberating. If the food had stunned them and the work unsettled them, what came next broke them entirely. Wages. Each prisoner was credited with 80 cents a day for his labor, a sum they could spend in the camp's small canteen. For men raised in a Reich, where soldiers were paid little and expected to offer loyalty for nothing, this was incomprehensible. One corporal muttered, half bitter, half amazed, "I fought for Hitler and received nothing. I picked cotton for a cowboy, and I am paid." The canteen became its own small world. Behind its wooden counter, prisoners could buy cigarettes, stationery, soap, and sometimes even luxuries like chocolate. To men who had braced themselves for starvation, this felt surreal, like stepping through the looking glass. A private who bought a chocolate bar wrote in a censored letter home, "I am embarrassed to tell you, but here I eat things I never tasted as a free man." The contradiction gnawed at them. They were enemies, locked behind barbed wire, and yet they had more agency here than many had ever known back home. Some prisoners were hired out to nearby ranches, working under the watchful eye of local families. These jobs blurred the lines between captivity and civilian life. Farmers would sometimes invite the Germans to sit on porches after long days, handing them lemonade or biscuits. One elderly Texan later recalled a German sitting quietly beside him, staring at the prairie. When asked what he thought, the young man whispered, "I never saw a country so big, it does not end." The old man remembered his voice carried not defiance, but awe. Yet with these privileges came conflict. Inside the barracks, men divided into factions, Some clung to ideology, sneering that kindness was just another trick. Others admitted privately that they were grateful, even curious. The tension simmered. Guards noticed and began separating hardliners from those who showed signs of adapting. Still, the damage to certainty was done. Every chocolate bar bought, every cigarette smoked, every glass of lemonade sipped under a rancher's porch chipped away at the certainties the right had instilled in them. It wasn't just about food or pay. It was about dignity. For the first time, some realized that authority could acknowledge them as men, even in defeat. "Here I am, still treated as human," one letter noted. "While at home, I was treated only as a tool." To prisoners who had believed in the power of fear, this was perhaps the most dangerous revelation of all. By late 1943, the barbed wire no longer felt like the only boundary in camp. Something unexpected had taken root inside the fences. Culture. For men who had expected to waste away in misery, the discovery was unsettling. Classes began springing up in dusty recreation halls and in corners of the barracks. Local teachers volunteered to teach English, using chalkboards propped against wooden beams. Guards doubled as instructors in woodworking or mechanics. Even the prisoners themselves organized lectures, mathematics, literature, even history, delivered by former professors and engineers among their ranks. The result was a camp that looked less like a prison and more like an improvised university. At night, the barracks glowed with lantern light as men hunched over scraps of paper, practicing English words. "Hello, coffee, cowboy." Some smirked at the absurdity. Others repeated the sounds carefully, as though grasping at something forbidden. For men indoctrinated by Hitler's propaganda, it was disorienting to learn from their captors, and yet impossible to resist. "I learned more in 1 year of captivity than in all the years of Hitler's speeches," one prisoner later confessed in his memoir. The arts flourished too. Harmonica players filled the nights with plaintive folk songs, soon joined by violins and accordions that prisoners had smuggled into their kit or built from scraps. At first, the music was German, sad ballads of home, of rivers and forests. But over time, American tunes crept into the repertoire. Cowboys sang by the fences, and prisoners echoed the melodies, awkwardly at first, then boldly. Songs once associated with saloons and Western films rang out inside the wire, played by the very men who had marched under swastikas. A guard later remembered pausing during his rounds, listening to Germans play "Home on the Range" in thick accents. "It was strange," he said, "but it made the night feel smaller, like the wire didn't matter." Then came the newspapers. Using mimeograph machines, prisoners began printing their own camp papers. By 1945, more than 400 POW newspapers circulated across America, each filled with editorials, jokes, poems, and essays. Some criticized Hitler, thinly veiled in allegory. Others marveled at the contradictions of captivity. One issue bluntly asked, "Why do we claim superiority when the cowboy feeds us and we cannot feed ourselves?" Such words would have been treason back in Germany. Here, they were posted on bulletin boards. Culture became both a refuge and a weapon. It gave the men dignity, a way to fight despair. But it also cracked open dangerous questions. Could it be that behind barbed wire, they were freer in thought than they had ever been at home? Every poem, every song, every joke printed in a camp paper added to the unease. The Reich had promised them greatness. The Americans gave them coffee, lessons, and songs. Which one, they began to wonder, offered true power? For the Germans, the cowboy became more than just a guard. He became a symbol, a figure larger than life who carried an authority they couldn't quite understand. Raised under a system where discipline came through shouting, threats, and rigid obedience, they were baffled by men who ruled with silence. A cowboy leaning against a post, hat tilted against the sun, spoke louder than 1,000 Nazi salutes. His authority wasn't barked, it was worn. Prisoners whispered about him in their bunks. Some called him lazy, unable to accept that a man could command without cruelty. Others admitted that his ease carried a weight that no officer back home possessed. One diary entry captured the paradox. He does not fear me, and he does not need to prove he is stronger. This I cannot understand. What unsettled them most was the cowboy's relationship with work. He labored beside his horse, fixing fences, guiding cattle, or carrying hay with the same calloused hands that rested near a rifle. Authority in the German system meant avoiding labor, standing apart from the men below you. Authority here meant being the first to work, the last to complain, and never needing to boast. One prisoner, after watching a cowboy stroke his horse's neck gently while humming, wrote, "I saw more kindness in his hand on that animal than I saw in all my years of service." It was a revelation, authority tied not to fear, but to care. The cowboy also symbolized something else: independence. To Germans who had grown up in tightly packed towns and under suffocating bureaucracy, the sight of endless prairie was already overwhelming. To see a man stride across it as if it belonged to him alone was almost unbearable. They began to spin myths among themselves. They said the cowboy bowed to no officer because he had none. They said his land was so wide he could never be cornered. They said his strength lay not in uniform or rank, but in his freedom. For the prisoners, this realization was both humbling and terrifying. The Reich had promised them superiority through fear, obedience, and conquest. Yet here, in a dusty camp in Texas, the true embodiment of strength looked nothing like the Nazi ideal. It wore spurs, carried a rope, and tipped its hat without arrogance. By the time winter winds swept across the plains, many prisoners admitted quietly, if only to themselves, that they envied the men guarding them. "They are free in a way we have never been," one soldier wrote, "and they do not even know how extraordinary that is." Not every man inside the barbed wire accepted this strange kind of captivity. For some, the abundance of food, the wages, and the quiet authority of cowboys felt like poison. Die-hard Nazis called it a trap, a way for America to weaken them. These loyalists tried to police the barracks, bullying others who smiled at guards or studied English words. In some camps, American officials even had to separate them into different sections, afraid they would intimidate the men who were softening to this new reality. The barracks became battlefields of another kind, not with bullets, but with whispers, jeers, and clenched fists in the night. Yet even the hardest men could not ignore the cracks forming. Soccer matches erupted inside the wire, the ball bouncing against fences, while guards leaned against posts and watched. When a ball sailed too far, a cowboy booted it back with effortless skill, grinning at the laughter it sparked. It was absurd, enemies sharing a game. But in that absurdity, something broke. The wall between conqueror and captive blurred, if only for a heartbeat. "We were supposed to hate them," one prisoner later wrote, "but in that moment, I hated only the fence that kept us apart." And then came the news that no one could ignore. By spring of 1945, rumors filtered through the camps. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The Reich had collapsed. The prisoners sat on their bunks in stunned silence, staring at their boots, their hands, the floorboards beneath them. Some wept openly. Grief-stricken, not just by the loss of a nation, but by the collapse of everything they had been taught to believe. Others clenched their fists, whispering bitter oaths that their homeland had been betrayed. But outside the wire, the cowboys moved as they always had, feeding cattle, adjusting saddles, sipping coffee before dawn. The contrast was brutal. Hitler had promised permanence, yet delivered ruin. The cowboy had promised nothing, yet endured. For the prisoners, it was a revelation sharper than any lecture. Strength, it seemed, wasn't born from uniforms or parades, but from the quiet rhythm of a life rooted in labor and freedom. As one German wrote in his diary, "The Reich gave me fear. The cowboy gave me respect." When repatriation began, the men lined up once more for the trains that would carry them back across the Atlantic. Relief filled the air, but so did unease. Many dreaded the return, knowing their families had suffered hunger and bombing while they had eaten beef stew and smoked cigarettes behind fences. One letter confessed, "We lived better in captivity than our people did in freedom." What does that say of us? It was a question no one dared answer. The trains rolled east, but memories clung like shadows. Men who had once seen themselves as destined rulers of Europe now carried back images of cowboys leaning against fence posts, of harmonicas drifting on warm nights, of hands that worked hard without cruelty. For some, it was humiliation. For others, it was transformation. And for all, it was unforgettable.